Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. David Klyne. David, thanks for being with us this morning.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Jack.
So, to give some context for the conversation, David, can you talk about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Look, I'll give you a little bit longer version. I came up as trained through human movement sciences, then went on to do training in physiotherapy, and then I had an interest in research, I guess more specifically, I had an interest in wanting to ask questions that couldn't be answered,
Mm,
at least by my teachers and whatnot. And so I went to UQ and did a PhD under the wing of Professor Paul Hodges, who really opened me up to, I guess, lateral thinking
mm,
in a clinical sense. So clinical questions, but answering them via basic science methods. So, which is a real challenge in the clinic because there's lots of things that we want to know, and usually at that end, clinicians want to know, well, what can we do with it? How can we apply something?
mm,
Um, where I want to take a step back by trying to understand from the very minute level what might be going on, so that way we can sharpen our clinical tools at the other end by having a better understanding what's going on and being able to, I guess, tailor individualized and target treatments better. So during my PhD, which was in neuroscience, I also undertook separate training in molecular biology. And so that grew a real passion for physiology and biology of pain. So essentially, I'm a pain scientist, and over the years, I've built a pretty good research team where we focus on trying to ask questions that are important clinically, but right from the very scratch, right, that very basic level,
mm,
the physiology, biology of pain. But particularly, we're interested in how everyday factors, behavioural factors such as how we sleep, how we move, how we eat, how those things might influence pain, whether it be acute pain, the transition from acute to chronic, or a flare up of existing symptoms. But trying to understand how those things influence the biology of pain, and then how we might be able to target those factors in the clinic. So my team is about 10 strong,
mhm.
and we originally worked as part of a centre called the Centre for Clinical Research Excellence in Spinal Pain Injury and Health that no longer exists now. I'm linked with a centre that's very new, which is called CIPHER. It's actually called the Centre for Innovation in Pain and Health Research. I think that's right. But it's all exciting at UQ because this new centre, going a little bit off target, encompasses anyone really at UQ who's associated, or their research associates with pain. So it means that we have a very, very broad network of connections across right from that very clinical end to the very, very basic end to
Mm.
try and help answer questions around pain rather than being fragmented. In the past, and a lot of centres around that deal with pain, all these little groups that don't interact with one another. So hopefully that's going to improve things. So that's me. I'm a pain scientist, small team working within that centre.
No, and I think that's reflective too of some of the research you've done and like looking at, say, Paul Hodges' research and the different directions it's taken as well. And it's always good to sometimes talk to your neighbors to see what they're doing and how that may actually be relevant to the research you're doing as well. There's a few things I wanted to touch on though there. And one of the first things you mentioned was how going through your PhD really helped you to think more laterally. And I was actually curious to understand that a bit further. Like, I'm assuming that ties in with looking more at the basic sciences, as you mentioned, how that fits in clinically. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on expanding on that because I think that is something that's often very much underestimated or underappreciated how valuable it is to continue building your basic sciences in anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, and how that reflects clinical practice.
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's two things. Firstly, it's really important. The more you understand further down, if you're deeper into the problem as a clinician, it's going to help you rationalize and clinical reason how you want to apply treatments. But also, for me, it's extremely interesting.
Mm,
So when I did my PhD, my project was I was helping Paul Hodges run a large NHMRC cohort study,
Mm.
which was essentially based around trying to identify what predicts the transition from acute to chronic back pain. And the way we did it was we brought in about 200 people over many years that had an acute episode, that just hurt their back, an acute episode of back pain within a couple of weeks of hurting their back. So it was a really tight criteria. It's difficult to get those participants in that very early stage. And every as soon as we brought them in, we measured a whole heap of psychosocial behavioural type things via a lot of online questionnaires and whatnot. But we also brought them into the laboratory and ran a number of laboratory tests for about 4 hours on these participants. And we did this every 3 months for 12 months. It was really, it still is the most detailed data collection for individuals with acute back pain. And the idea is that we wanted to isolate or identify those factors that most strongly predicted those who either went on to recover or those who went on to get worse or get chronic back pain. And for a long time, we've known that psychosocial things have always been best predictors of these things. And that was the case in this study. For me, that was a little bit, with lack of a better term, depressing, because for me, I was really interested in all the blood markers we were looking at, all the biological things, and then all those things come out and you go, oh, well, these things that we've known for such a long time, the psychosocial status of someone is probably a big predictor. But what came out from it was when we dug a little deeper, which a lot of studies haven't done in the past, is some of these blood markers, some of these immune patterns that we were looking at when we profiled the immune system were very tightly linked with how someone was sleeping, how someone was feeling. And it was these factors of how they were feeling and how they were sleeping was contingent upon these immune profiles. And so it was really reliant on these two things to come together to depend on whether someone got better or worse. And the reason that's important is because we often think, well, okay, someone psychologically is struggling in this area. They might be showing depressive symptoms. They might be catastrophizing with their pain. Okay, yeah, they're more likely to have these features that dictate that they'll go and have persistent or ongoing pain. But the reality was a large portion of them didn't. But when we looked at those who had these psychological features or sleep patterns that also had these immune profiles combined with them, they were the ones that almost all went on to have a poor outcome. And the key thing there is that when you dig a bit deeper down, how we sleep, how we feel, how we move influences these immune profiles, and vice versa. These immune profiles influence how we sleep, how we feel. There's sort of this cyclic pattern, right? And they're related to each other. And those things are important ultimately to come together to influence pain. And so that's where my interest coming, I guess, thinking a little bit laterally rather than thinking this one psychological feature or this one sleep pattern is predictive. In fact, it was a combination of these things need to work together. And if you take a short step back and not think about everything that you've learned in training, you go, well, that makes sense. It makes sense because sleep has biological processes. How we feel has biological processes, and these things are linked together. It makes complete sense. There's a biological pathway between how we sleep, how we feel, our immune changes, and how those things are associated with pain. So that's how my thinking started to go that way, dig a little bit deeper in how these things are connected.
Yeah, and the thing I think that's really important to highlight there is, again, just speaking from my own experiences when I did undergraduate physiotherapy, they obviously talk about the biopsychosocial model, but I, like probably most of my peers at the time who were all 18, 19, 20, when you hear a biopsychosocial, you go, yeah, okay, like I know psychological social measures might be important, but I want to learn the mechanics and I want to learn the diagnosis and formulate a treatment plan on that. And the thing that I've really valued about some of the research coming out of your publications is understanding the pathophysiological underpinnings of how those things are related, because it's still one of the big issues I see at the moment is when we think about humans, how do you actually identify a human system? And more importantly, related to that is when you think about the musculoskeletal system, it's a part of that broader biological system that's regulated by other non-physical systems, i.e., your central nervous system, your endocrine system, your cardiovascular system. The list goes on. And when you start to actually look into that and go, okay, when we start to see sleep deprivation, we see certain immunological responses that predispose someone to persistent pain, and more importantly, some of the peripheral changes that occur in association with that. That to me becomes very interesting and curious, and obviously opens up some more understanding of what type of interventions may help regulate that further. So let's dive a little bit into that a bit more, because you've obviously done a lot of research of looking at the role of inflammation, of systemic health. You mentioned things like sleep, how that influences the immune system, and that how that may potentially influence peripheral tissue. Can we talk a little bit more in detail about that? And perhaps we start with some of the sleep research that you've done.
Yeah, sure. Look, well, our first real indication of the relationship between sleep and pain came from that cohort study during my PhD, where we identified that poor sleep was a predictor of poor outcome. Better sleep was a predictor of good outcome. But it was really strong, that relationship, when it was tied together with certain immune profiles. And for a long, long time, we've known that sleep and pain are associated, typically in the past, and still a lot in the clinic. It's thought of as that, well, it's your pain interfering with your sleep. And we've known from our work and those more recently that, in fact, it's also the other way around. But even stronger than that, we think that sleep has a stronger impact on pain than the other way around. And so in animals, we can start to dig down on that, the mechanism. So we've used animal models to have a little look closer at that. And we had to, because the reality is, when we've identified these things in cohort studies, which ours is not the only cohort study. This has been identified many times over, sleep being related to poor outcome with respect to pain. We actually have absolutely no idea or any evidence that poor sleep drives the development of chronic pain, or whether it's actually pathologically linked to pain. We just don't know. The only mechanistic studies we really have in humans to go off is that if you deprive someone of sleep, they may have an upregulation of certain inflammatory proteins, and they also become more sensitive to stimuli, might be pressure or something like that, than the day before. So that's all we had. And so it's a long bow to draw to then tie, well, sleep is pathologically linked to pathological pain, particularly chronic pain development. So we had to go back and think about how we tease out testing these questions, whether that's true, and looking at in animal models of pain. So what we've done is we've had these. We developed a new model of sleep, poor sleep, in animals, because in the past, what's typically happened, when sleep's been investigated, particularly poor sleep, they'll acutely deprive these animals of sleep, or in such a way that it's completely non-reflective of what you'd see in the human condition. So the normal poor sleeper, like me, maybe like you, like a lot of people, like a large chunk of the population, you don't undergo extreme sleep deprivation for days, and that's your poor sleep. That's not how it works. We tend to have these subtle periods of poor quality. It might be deprivation. But more importantly, it's probably a reduction in quality, whether you're fragmented during the night, waking up or not, how long you're sleeping for certain periods, and things like that. So what we did for the to sort of try and mimic that in animals is that we observed rats, a group of rats, during the light phase. So from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Now for rats, that's when they typically like to sleep. And we would go in there and we would have people observing these rats. And as soon as they looked like they were going to drift off to sleep, we would gently stimulate them with food pellets, change their bedding, give them toys and things like that, to be as less stressful as possible. And that is absolutely key, because stress itself is a huge or a potent inducer of inflammation. And so these studies that have looked at animals that have tried to deprive them of sleep in the past. And the way they do that, by the way, is, they might electric shock, or they might put them on top of a tiny little surface area, like a little plate. And as soon as they fall off, they fall into water. These sorts of things are extremely stressful.
Yes.
And the immune response that you get is enormous, but it's probably not because of the sleep, lack of sleep. It's because of this stress response. And so tying that together and trying to understand the relationship between sleep and pain in that context is flawed. So we would do this throughout the day. And what we do is we do that over a period of time. We do it on random days of the week so they didn't adapt, and it wouldn't be all the time. Rats are pretty smart. They would start to learn to sleep a little bit more during dark phase if we did it every day. So this was really the first study that looked at ongoing reductions in quality of sleep. And we would take blood samples from the tail and we'd measure a whole suite of behavioural measures that would give us an indication that the animal might be in pain or whether it's getting worse. And we did this after an injury. So the injury we gave to the animals was it was an operant type of injury, which means that we didn't go in there and cut something or tie something. It was completely natural in the sense that we trained the rats to pull on a lever at a set force. And when it was reached a set force, it would release a food pellet. And so they were rewarded. And they'd learn to pull at a certain high force really repetitively over a period of time. And very quickly, they developed this acute onset repetitive strain injury type symptoms, showing lots of signs of pain. And this operant model was developed by Professor Mary Barr who I worked with during my PhD, but also during my Fulbright fellowship in the United States. So these animals that underwent this injury, after this acute onset of repetitive strain injury and symptoms that were reflective of pain, we then split the animals to either receive this 4 weeks of poor sleep during that model I just explained. We had another group of animals that were exposed to having access to a running wheel. And they were given access to this running wheel during the dark phase when they're active. And so it was, again, non-stressful because they voluntarily used the treadmill to run and exercise when they wanted to. And they all run, by the way. Rats love running. And we were clocking up 4 or 5 kilometres a night that they were running. It's ridiculous. And then there was a third group of rats that were exposed to both. So they were exposed to poor sleep during the day, and then they were given access to a running wheel during the night, so they wanted to run. Took these blood samples periodically and these behavioural measures periodically. From that work, we recently published a paper that really is the first evidence to suggest that poor sleep, at least in an animal model, may in fact drive the development from acute to persistent pain. What we showed is that as after injury, you'd expect to see this normal increase in immune proteins associated with inflammation. We saw the classic signs of inflammation after injury. Now, those that continue to experience poor sleep, essentially a number of key markers either persisted or increased over time. These very tightly were linked with these behavioural pain measures that we were taking, so looking at pressure sensitivity, not just locally at the site, but also at distant sites. And these became more severe over time. Now, the key and the really interesting thing is that the animals that exercised went the other way, right? They had a massive reduction in these immune markers, reduction in pain behaviours. But the animals that exercised, as well as were sleep deprived, also followed the same trajectory as the exercise-only animals, so these immune markers and sleep, which gave us a real indication that, in fact, exercise might be offsetting the impact of poor sleep on the immune system and ultimately protecting against the development of chronic pain. And that's probably not surprising because bringing in exercise or movement, exercise, so it increases in it, particularly moderate exercise, has a very positive impact on the immune system in that it over time decreases baseline levels of inflammation. And it does that via a very similar pathway to sleep, poor sleep, but in the opposite way. So poor sleep will increase those baseline levels of inflammation. And so for us, that was fascinating because it gives us an idea that perhaps for those who sleep poorly, exercise could in fact be used to offset the effects of poor sleep if sleep in those participants is difficult to modify. I'll take one step further and say what we're looking at now is whether we're looking at the brains of these animals and the central nervous system to see whether some of these immune markers are also within the central nervous system, in the spine, particularly the brain. And so we're basically ticking off the final things that give us an idea causally how these changes in potential systemic inflammation might be modifying the nervous system to influence or drive the development of chronic pain. And so we've got a series of animal experiments now that are looking deeper into that to connect to mechanisms. I know that's a long answer, but essentially that's what we're starting to do, or what we have been doing in animals. And the great thing is we're able to profile these immune responses that we think are responsible, or the way via which sleep drives persistent pain. Now testing these in humans, these immune profiles. So the animal models gave us a chance to look at all this stuff, try and tie together what the actual causes are, and then we can pick out the things that are important that we know would suggest that that's happening in humans, but look at it in humans to see if it's true. That's the next step.
The thing I think of with those results is people I know who, particularly who are triathletes or run marathons or do Ironmans, who get up at 4 a.m. every morning to exercise 3 hours before they go to work. And I was thinking, how do you manage with all this sleep deprivation? But perhaps one of the key mechanisms is the fact that exercise is offsetting a lot of the negative issues associated with sleep deprivation.
Potentially.
Yeah. The other thing I found interesting from that study was looking at some of the specific markers too related to things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And the reason why I thought that was interesting because BDNF for short is associated with an increase in neuroplasticity, correct?
Correct.
And I think most people associate, well, if you're increasing neuroplasticity, that must be a good thing. But then, of course, if you have that in the presence of pain or nociceptive input, then that may lead to some of the central changes associated with chronic pain. Am I interpreting that correctly?
No, you're right, and it's difficult. I mean, I think so. The way you ask that question is really important from a clinical perspective, because most people outside of the clinic would think that inflammation's bad.
Yes.
Inflammation's a normal, adaptive, healthy response. It's
Yes.
only when it goes wrong, and that applies to most things in biology. So, brain-derived neurotrophic factor is a growth factor. It's one of a few growth factors, probably the most important one within the human body for driving changes, growth within the nervous system. So it's involved in stimulating, the development of new connections and that sort of thing within the nervous system. A whole host of things that are basically in developing and advancing, growing the nervous system. And now that's obviously really, really, really important. And the unfortunate thing in biology from a clinical perspective is that it's never simple. It's not that, something goes up, that's bad, or something goes down, that's bad, or that's good. It's a really, really delicate balance. Now,
Well, and the same can be said for certain inflammatory markers and cytokines, where in the context of certain chemical environments, things like interleukin-4 can be pro or anti-inflammatory from what I understand, or I can't remember if it was that one specifically, but I know some of them can have a different physiological response based on, say, the biochemical milieu, so to speak.
yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, look, and this is where research, particularly a lot of clinical research, has hugely got it wrong, right? We are an extremely complex, made-up system, and we ask the most simplest questions that don't give any context or real understanding all the time of what we're trying to ask. It's like it's like saying there's 10,000 pathways to get to something in the body from one A to B. And we're looking at one pathway and saying, it didn't go up and so it doesn't happen. But of course, it could have taken 10,000 other avenues to get there. And then we make these assumptions. And this is where research goes backwards. We ask these very fundamental, these very basic questions of a very complex system. So as you were saying, a lot of cytokines are the messengers of the body. And inflammation, really, when it boils down to it, is basically a system of communication. So cytokines, which make up a heavy part of inflammation, are basically communication molecules. They go and tell something to do something else. Right? Sometimes it's to repair, sometimes it's to heal, sometimes it's to try and help clean up debris or invaded pathogens and things like that. It's only when there's a mix-up in the messaging that there's a problem typically. So they're doing something a little bit different than what they should be doing. So for interleukin-6, which is probably what you're referring to before,
Interleukin-6, I think, yes.
but there's a lot of other cytokines that are pleiotropic. In fact, so a lot of cytokines aren't pro or anti-inflammatory. They can do both, and they work on a continuum. In fact, they might be doing a bit of both at the same time. So you can imagine research. We go, okay, we're looking at this one inflammatory marker, and if it goes up, it's bad, it's pro-inflammatory. But how on earth do you know at the time that it was doing an anti-inflammatory thing? You just don't know. It's context dependent. And that's the same with BDNF. Most of the time, BDNF is doing what it needs to do, building connections. The theory is that during times where the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system might be undergoing changes that might not be the changes that are beneficial. They might be enhancing the nervous system, for example, to respond to stimuli. BDNF would play a role in that development. And that's probably driven by inflammatory events within the body. They might be slightly getting it wrong. So it's stimulating things, BDNF, one of those things. It's then slightly getting it wrong. And next thing you have a nervous system that's more sensitive than probably what it should be to incoming stimuli.
Yes. And I think the other thing that you mentioned that's worth highlighting is you're looking at baseline inflammation. Because in reality, when you think about something like exercise, particularly high intensity exercise, it will cause some acute inflammation. And that's actually important signaling to the body to adapt. And so the issue is not inflammation itself. It's more that alteration in baseline inflammatory markers that's characteristic of chronic inflammation that then leads to a lot of systemic maladaptations, and it's probably the actual basis to a lot of chronic diseases we see these days, including a lot of musculoskeletal pain.
Yeah, correct. It's like, as you said, exercise, for example, is an acute increase in inflammation, and that's for a number of reasons. Some of it's restorative. Some of it, like interleukin-6, has a huge role in energy processes within the muscle, and that. So for glycogen, things like that to stimulate that process. So it's needed, but it really comes down to a couple of things. Someone who might have a primed immune system, which means that at rest or through normal life, you're okay. But if you have an injury or something happens as a life event, that immune response, because it's slightly off and the communication is not right for whatever reason, it might be triggered, it might be primed to respond inappropriately. So that's when you see an inappropriate inflammatory response. In some people, you see that there's an elevation, there's just a mismatch or an imbalance of what should be there at the time, which is problematic. There's a few things. Ultimately, it comes down to very delicate coordination of these immune markers that need to happen in very precise moments and timings, depending all literally from hours or 30-minute cycles, 5-minute cycles throughout the day. There's a natural shift and flow throughout the day that you should see with lots of different individual biomarkers, millions of them. And when they're slightly off, which sleep can have an impact on, it shifts that circadian pattern or timing of them. That's when problems can arise, for example.
Yeah, and that also helps to make sense too when you think about the issues with, say, long-term use of anti-inflammatories, which you see some athletes do, and how that can then prevent adaptation of the muscle because satellite cells may not become activated or proliferated. Or I know I got quite interested in looking at oxidative stress and people taking antioxidants, which could be something as simple as vitamin E or vitamin C, potentially suppressing adaptations from aerobic exercise. And so we have to be careful about then too with things that we put in our body, because that can also then disrupt this very delicate balance of the inflammatory responses that we have to different types of stimulus.
Yeah, it's a really good question clinically. I think clinicians should ask themselves in a really healthy way, because I'm not a medical doctor and I'm certainly not saying what's right or wrong. But we should ask ourselves, should you be suppressing some of these things when that's what it's there to do after you injure yourself, or whatever it might be? NZs are something that I go to a lot of the time. Some of the things you're talking about, a lot of the time these are adaptive processes. And hey, we haven't solved pain yet. We've been looking at pain for hundreds of years. We've got how much closer have we got to preventing the development of chronic pain in humans over the last 100, 200 years? Well, it's a cough under your thing. Well, we've really done next to very, very, very little.
Well, there's probably a bigger discussion there too to think about what environmental factors have changed, particularly over the last, let's say, 50 to 100 years, but even probably the last 50 years, that are also influencing our physiology. Because I also think about then some of the changes in the average population when we think about rates of overweight or obesity, changes in exercise and physical activity, changes in sleep. And I mean, as you've just highlighted with sleep, like these are things that I think people probably underestimate of how relevant that is to the development of musculoskeletal pain conditions, or even just the actual recovery from acute musculoskeletal injuries themselves, let alone chronic pain.
So, while the problem is complex and there's many things involved, many different things involved, I think sometimes we've tried to think about the problem um, in an overly complicated way, and rather perhaps it's just simple things that there's two things: simple things that we overlook, and simple things that, as human beings, it's just we don't want to have to do. We want to look for that magic pill. What I can, from my research, and at least in the area that I work in, some of the things that keep coming through with these typical behavioral things are, sure, inactivity. So inactivity and low sleep. I mean, let's be honest. If ever there's been a time in society where inactivity, overweight, and poor sleep is at high rates, it's right now,
Mm.
and it's getting worse. Those two things are enormous, and I guess tied with that, although this is not my strong area of research, but I would suspect that stress, anxiety, depression, and those things
Mm.
are at extremely high levels as well when you look back over the last 50, 100 years.
Yes.
And what I will say with overweight is that that's not just tied with inactivity, it's also tied with poor diet. All these things, when it all comes down to it, are tightly linked with inflammation in our immune system.
Mm.
People, I keep trying to get the message out there that these things aren't something that are just in the air and they might influence something. Ultimately, they have a big impact on your immune system, your immune response to anything. And if that's the case, we should be I guess, thinking about it more seriously, because ultimately those are things that are driving our immune system, our immune changes that are linked to not just pain, but a whole health of health problems. And ultimately, I always say inflammation is the bane of everything. And there's several key drivers of inflammation. And the bonus is that they're all extremely modifiable. As human beings, we don't like to say, well, lose weight, be more active, sleep better, push it to the side and wait for that magic pill. And I'm sorry, the magic pill isn't coming.
No. Well, and there is something to be said about that where unfortunately the pharmaceutical industry is big for a reason, because people do prefer, the passive process of taking some exogenous substance to help them, whether it be pain or something else. But the other thing I find interesting though too is there's been actually a lot of people who've tried to replicate the effects of exercise through some type of pharmaceutical as well, but none have ever actually been successful at doing it, because the reality is the complexity of exercise and the stress that it applies to multiple systems is obviously very hard to replicate with a pill, because as you're talking about before, when you're thinking about molecular pathways, with exercise, they look to see if it, depending on whether it's aerobic or an anaerobic, maybe we need to increase mTOR, or maybe we need to increase the aerobic pathway. Let's take a pill to be able to upregulate that system, but you don't see the same response. And
Yeah.
so I think that's the thing I actually really value about some of the work that your team has done, is actually highlighting, look, let's not go away from the simple things. It may be unfortunate, it may not be necessarily sexy, but you actually have to consider that these are big things that regulate our biology and physiology and that contribute to someone's pain condition.
Yeah, and I think if I was to tell a clinician this, I mean, I was like, you just arm your patients
Mm.
with education to get buy-in from them.
Mm.
Arm them with evidence and give them an education and going, there's hardcore biological links between how you sleep, inflammation and pain, between
Mm.
how you feel,
Mm.
what you eat, how you move, between inflammation and pain. And maybe that will help get buy-in from them, because it may be patients take that with a grain of salt if they're told that, but maybe they don't believe it because they're saying, yeah, but my pain's here, how I sleep? And my answer to that would be, well, okay, if you're sleeping poorly, that changes your the inflammation that's within your circulation. That inflammation within your circulation communicates right down to the tissue cellular level, to where you're saying you're feeling this pain. So that ultimately can have an effect on the balance of what's happening within that muscle. And that can change whether it becomes fibrotic or not, and a whole host of other tissue-related health things. Now, if you don't want that to become chronic, well, you might want to change your baseline systemic levels of inflammation, because over time, that's going to contribute to advancing your nervous system down a road that you don't want to be going down towards chronic pain. Getting that sort of buy-in from patients would be great if clinicians, I guess, could maybe educate them in a way to help literally make them think, you know what, there's actually a truth behind that. It's not just some airy-fairy stuff.
Yeah, and I think also too, thinking about analogies that help people, because I often think of it at the starting point of going, how do you feel after a really bad night's sleep? People go, oh, terrible. I feel stiff, I feel irritable, blah, blah, blah. And
Yeah.
I think you can then use that similar analogy. Like the reason that's occurring is a lot of it has to do with the inflammatory response from poor sleep. And I
Yeah.
often like the bucket analogy, where we're constantly filling up our bucket with different types of stresses, and we use something like sleep to empty the bucket, so to speak. And obviously,
Yeah.
the less that you sleep to empty the bucket, the more likely you're going to get to that point where it overfills, and then you start to get tissue damage and degradation that can be associated with pain.
Yeah.
Can we actually talk a little bit more about that? Because the other thing that I've been really interested of some of the research that's coming from you and some of your colleagues at UQ is thinking about how chronic inflammation alters peripheral tissue environment. And I know you published an article some years back, and it was more of a talking about I can't think of the process, like trying to actually explain the relationship between things like systemic inflammation, local inflammation, sleep, psychological stresses, and how that influences the tissue quality.
Yeah. So what we tried to do in that paper was to do what really no one else has done, is try and provide a plausible pathways by which some of these lifestyle things, so we called it mind, but we're talking about lifestyle things, so environment, how you sleep, how you feel, try and provide a biological pathway by which those things can actually influence your tissue health. So at the tissue level, and really we're talking about things like muscle fibrosis. So how on earth can fibrosis at the end in one of your muscles at the end of your phalangeal be affected by how you sleep? And that's the connection we were trying to make in that paper. And a lot of it comes out of animal research, so a lot of it's not tested in humans. So we draw our understanding from animal research, and then we try and link it to human studies to see whether similar patterns have occurred that we've identified that might suggest that's also happening in humans. So really, the difficult bit is not that how these things like sleep, diet, exercise, how they influence systemic inflammation. We know they influence systemic inflammation quite heavily. The link is, how does systemic inflammation influence local inflammation? So if we think of systemic inflammation, a lot of the time it refers to circulating levels, so within your blood. And that's the most immediate response that you will see of inflammation if you're having a bad night's sleep or you're exercising, because it runs quickly within circulation. It might be stimulated from the brain, it might be stimulated from muscles, it might be stimulated from fat cells, a whole heap of things, but ultimately we pick it up quickly in circulation. There are a couple of pathways which are very plausible by which this systemic inflammation can impact local inflammation. It's technical and it's complicated, but effectively there's a number of proteins that we think, from the very basic science that we've done in petri dishes. So that's kind of how we have to test these things, right? Because in biology, even in a local environment, you can imagine there's billions of things going on. So we have to pull apart what we think, how what might be happening outside of the local tissues in the systemic environment might communicate back and forth to the local environment. And we can do that in petri dishes. Some of my colleagues have done things like that, and it's very, very mechanistic research where we test very slight combinations of different receptors and proteins to see how they might interact locally from outside that local environment. And there are some things that certainly have an impact, and we've only looked at a few. When I say we, my colleagues, some of these proteins, cells are involved as well, but some of these proteins and chemicals communicate systemically to these local tissues in such a way that they're ultimately communicating and altering that inflammatory environment. And that inflammatory environment, and I come back to inflammation because inflammation, don't think of as a bad or a good thing. It's how things communicate. So this makes sense. How does the systemic communicate with the local, the very tissue level stuff? Of course, you'd expect there'd be a communication cycle. If something's going on out there, the body's trying to tell something or adapt something at the very, very local level. It has to have the ability to do that. And so some of these pathways have been tested, and some of them we can see they have changes. Now, are they big changes? No, but we suspect that there's probably many, many, many hundreds, thousands, millions of these different pathways or proteins or chemicals that can actually go across and communicate. What we do know is that they can go across that local wall, so that cellular wall, may it be an individual muscle fiber into that cell, communicate, and also it communicates back. So not only does a systemic environment communicate across to those local tissues, local environment, and influence the inflammatory environment, which may influence fibrosis, that also communicates back, which can increase systemic inflammation. We know this, right? If you injure or you damage your muscle, why do you get a systemic effect? There is, of course, there's top-down things that are going on that modify that, but you have a spillover into circulation. A spillover into circulation of a lot of inflammatory type proteins that communicate across or literally spill across into circulation. It goes both ways. And the really neat thing is, when you think of it like that, is that it gives you an understanding of how important behavioral factors or everyday things of how you sleep, eat, and move can influence your tissues right at that very cellular level.
And I think to emphasize your point about how local affects systemic, I think of how you feel after you've induced DOMS or you've had like a massive contusion, because you certainly notice the systemic effects from that as well. And obviously you can make the assumption that that works the other way around as well.
Can I just make a point on
Go
that?
on. Yeah.
So the critical thing about this is it's cyclical, right? Sleep is heavily regulated by inflammatory molecules and proteins. Communicating things. Inflammation is a communication process. That's how it is regulated. How you feel is regulated by inflammatory processes all the time. That's the physiology and perhaps even the pathology behind all of these things. And we've known for a long time, animal research is a lot more advanced in this area. We've known for a very long time that how you feel, how you sleep, what your mood is, how active you might be, can influence inflammation, but also that inflammation can influence it top up. So bottom down, top up, goes round and round. If you inject someone, or in the past studies, an animal, if you just tweak a little injury to that muscle, or you inject something that incurs an inflammatory response, immediately these animals go through the processes of going through as if they've got a viral infection, right? So you get fatigue, your sleeping's off, you feel more sensitive, more pain, stiff in the joints, things like that. Your mood's really affected. These viral, or what they call sickness type symptoms in the animal world, are what we feel when we pick up a virus or anything like that. And the reason we feel that way is not often because of the virus, it's because of our immune response. It's inflammation. And so that gives you a pretty good understanding, hey, changes in our immune system kill inflammation. Okay, so there's a pretty strong link between those changes and changes in how I feel, how I sleep, and things like that. So it's cyclical.
I also then wondered too, I don't know if actually there's any research has been done on this, of when someone does exercise, for instance, where if you have a lot of indications of poor systemic health, you sleep poorly, you're physically inactive typically, and then you go and do some type of new novel stimulus, is the inflammatory response that you get larger based on your baseline health markers?
I'm not sure, but my guess
Mm,
would be that a lot of these baseline health markers will dictate your immune response. I suspect it comes back to the priming your system, right? So if you might be, let's say you have depression, clinical depression. Again, I'll keep harping on this. Inflammation, clinical depression is tightly linked with key cytokines, toxic pro-inflammatory cytokines to drive that pathology. Not surprising, those same cytokines are involved in pain. If you had depression, your immune system's probably going to, and you had nothing else, and you went and exercised, you hadn't done it before, new stimulus, of course you're going to be probably more primed to have a negative immune response, so inappropriate immune response compared to someone
mm.
who isn't. So I think I don't know, but to answer your question, there'd be a whole host of things that would determine whether someone had a healthy or not healthy, a suboptimal, optimal, inappropriate response or not.
Mm.
It's so highly dependent on so many different things.
Yeah. And it's funny you say that, using depression as an example. I read a study recently, and I'm no researcher, so perhaps people may be critical of the quality of the research, but it was a study looking at the correlation between depression and passive tissue stiffness, and seeing that there was a correlation between the two. And one of the things that's associated with the severity of DOMS that you experience, delayed onset muscle soreness, is the amount of passive stiffness you have. So I often wondered if there's also a direct relationship, because of how things like depression may influence the mechanics of our tissue, and therefore, if you have more passive stiffness, you're more likely to get more tissue damage that leads to the symptoms associated with DOMS. And that's obviously me extrapolating here, but it seems like a plausible mechanism.
It's a really good question. And theoretically, yes, is the answer to your question. It could be clinically difficult to prove,
Yes.
and maybe difficult to answer, but theoretically, yes. And they're really good questions, really, really good questions, because again, it's thinking laterally, right? It's people that typically haven't thought, well, oh, maybe that's why, So
Absolutely.
really good question.
Now, the other thing that I'm interested to talk a little bit more about is how tissue fibrosis influences, say, muscle mechanics. And I know your colleague Gregory James has actually done fair bit of research on this, but I know you've been involved in a bit of it as well. Perhaps I need to actually reach out to him to get him on the podcast. But I've been particularly fascinated of looking at how fibrosis may influence, say, sensory motor control. And I know, well, just to take a step back, I know a couple of years ago he published a paper looking at where fibrosis occurs and seeing that it has a more direct impact on the muscle spindles. This is some of the research he did with Carla Stecco. And I actually know Carla quite well because I'm heavily involved in the Fascial Manipulation Institute over in Italy. And the reason why I find that so fascinating is because, and important, is thinking about this, how that alters motor control, because that's obviously been a topic of discussion for many years now. And there's obviously been different types of interventions used to think about how we can influence that. But I often wonder then, is the issue then related towards more of a peripheral level that influences our motor output, and whether we need to think about how we can change the peripheral tissue to influence motor output?
I would love to give you a great answer on that. It's just I'm going to be complete, and this is where a good scientist knows when to pull up stumps and say it's not my area.
Yeah,
I Greg, you should get Greg on the show. He'd be great. He'd
absolutely.
give you some insight in that. The motor control and movement side of it is something I'm out of, and I have my lane, so I can't give you an answer on that.
Mm,
Greg is the guy to ask. His research in that, I know that area has been a little bit of a game changer.
mm,
Some of the stuff I've done with him has been looking more at the pathways by which the molecular pathways by which fibrosis occurs,
yes.
which is interesting itself, and of course it involves an inflammatory connection. But my work has not involved how it influences motor control or motor neurons and that sort of thing. So that's out of my realm, unfortunately, Jack.
Mm. That's all right. Well, one thing I did want to talk about a bit more is some of the clinical implications, and obviously something we've talked a lot about is sleep itself.
Mm.
What is good quality sleep, and what are things that we can influence, we can, recommend as clinicians to help better regulate sleep?
So every conference talk I have,
Mm.
first question, at least within the top three I have, is so how much sleep should they be having? Can patients be having? And my answer to that is, well, I'm not a sleep scientist,
Yes.
but but I answer this way. It's not. I think how much is not as important as how well. Quality is more important than duration. Is the first thing. There's clinical guidelines. There's evidence out there to suggest that 7 to 9 hours is ideal. And it's a U shape, right? So if you're sleeping less, it's bad. You reach a point, that Goldilocks area of 7 to 9 hours, which is considered good. And beyond that, it's bad as well.
Yes.
So that's a duration thing. But the problem is with duration, that gives us that we have. That doesn't mean it's good sleep. And clinically, what we're digging down to with our research now is trying to identify what aspects of sleep are important. So we know that there's certain aspects of sleep. So you have your this is still very basic, and I think sleep is much more complex than this. Typically, we think of it as these 4 stages, right? You go through, REMs, and you go through this descending period of deeper and deeper sleep through these different stages, and over that 90-minute period, you recycle back, and then you go through it again, right? Now, that's very basic. We as humans like to make things simple because it helps us understand things.
Sure.
I think, and a lot of other people think, that sleep is much more complicated than that, and there's these very complex patterns that occur throughout the night rather than these simple, nice little stages we go through. But it gives us an idea of essentially what types of brain patterns are occurring, frequencies and patterns, activity in the brain at certain stages. Slow wave sleep, which is the deepest form of sleep, is linked to really where we think restoration of our immune system and things like that occur. So we probably think that phase of sleep is probably really important then for things to do with health, including pain. Because if you're not going through that phase properly, you might not be getting the restorative processes involved for the immune system that you would need for each day. Now, when you come back to quality then, quality might be thinking, well, if you're having fragmented sleep, you have a disorder like apnea, and that you're not actually going into those. Some people don't even go into that deep sleep because they keep cutting off when they go back all the time. They wake up fragmented or whatnot. And so I always say, from the most simplest context, if a clinician asks me, I say, okay, there's 7 to 9 hours, which is great, but quality is more important than quantity. You would expect that someone's better to have a very short 4-hour window of sleep rather than 8 hours of on-off sleep. That's worse. And we think that getting those stages, those 90-minute cycles are key. And that does come back to things we've known for a long time, right? If you're going to have a cycle, try and sleep for an hour and a half or something like that, because you're going to go through those phases. What we're testing is looking at whether people who don't have those stages of sleep, like slow wave sleep, deep sleep, if they have less of that, do they have these pathological changes in the immune system that we see that are having a flow-on effect to their health, including pain. So that's what we would say. Now, the problem is, for us, it's easy as researchers to say, sleep's a problem, affects your immune system, affects your pain. But then getting people to change their sleep is not easy. We live in a tech world. Sleep hygiene is terrible. It's one of those things where you can, again, tell people a whole heap of tips, behavioural tips around improving their sleep hygiene, which have a really strong impact on how they sleep. But they don't do it. You don't drink caffeine, for example. There's been tips around for decades. You don't drink caffeine at a certain time in the afternoon. Don't have afternoon naps. That affects your duration of your sleep cycles throughout the night. Don't look at blue lights and that when you're in bed. It affects sleep, things like that. All these sorts of things.
Be in a cool room, be in a dark room. Yes.
All that stuff, right? So what we're looking at as well as other treatments like cognitive behavioural therapy. So there's a treatment, cognitive behavioural therapy for insomnia. It's been around for a long time. In fact, that's the gold standard for treating insomnia.
Mm.
And I really like this approach because I think it's going to give, if it works, if we prove it, we have a clinical trial starting up towards the end of this year, who I'm working with, co-PI of mine, Michelle Hall, the University of
Mm.
Sydney. And we're combining, in fact, that's where a lot of our animal works come together as a principle for testing this sleep treatment in humans. So we think if poor sleep's a bad thing, we might be able to improve the immune system and improve pain through cognitive behavioral therapy. And the key thing is with this is that if it works, it will give clinicians with a tool that they can have at their fingertips to potentially offer individuals who sleep poorly that have pain. And insomnia is one of those things where it's not that the individual is limiting or restricting their sleep. It's that they don't have the capacity to actually get enough sleep, or they're waking up, they're breaking it. But the reality is, though it's the most common sleep disorder, 30-40% of the population have it. It's a lot, right?
Mm.
There's probably a lot more that have it but are not diagnosed. And sleep deprivation or general poor sleep mimics probably the same immune responses that you would see with people with insomnia anyway. So my gut is, although as a disclosure here and a statement that I'm not saying this is what you should do, but my gut is that people who just sleep poorly would probably benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia-like symptoms anyway.
Mm.
And so we're hoping to have this tool that can be then clinicians can have at their hands to not just say, here's a fact sheet for sleep hygiene, but also, why don't we go through this 4-week cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia treatment, which can be easily learnt by any clinician and delivered by any clinician.
Mm. Yeah, that would be interesting to see the rollout of that. And I think also too, that's the thing that I think we need to get better at, is how we actually address all these non-physical factors, because they actually have such an important effect on the overall outcome of people that we work with.
Yeah, and that's why it's it's not surprising when the patient walks in the door, they not only have poor sleep,
Mm.
they have psychological symptoms. They might be depressed, and they might be inactive. And you know why? It's because all these things are connected by very common inflammatory pathways.
Well, and that's it. And obviously, I'm assuming for most clinicians, there are times where things don't respond the way that you expect. Part of that may be related to, there may be an incorrect diagnosis, but part of it may be related to the fact that you haven't addressed some of these other key modulators to the system that are influencing how they're responding to interventions that you're giving them as well.
That's right. And one of the mechanistic studies that we're looking at in animal models at the moment is actually trying to test whether sleep impacts different injuries differently.
Mm.
And now we're teasing down into the exact mechanisms of how sleep might influence pain based on the injury type. And when I say injury type, I mean whether it's a neuropathic type injury pain, so it's a nerve damage, predominantly nerve damage, or predominantly non-nerve damage, so it might be nociceptive or nociplastic type pain.
Yes.
And that's important, right? Because if an individual comes in and they have neuropathic pain, but sleep doesn't matter how they're sleeping, it doesn't impact that pain so much, well, then you wouldn't give it to them. And so this is the next layer of mechanistic research we're doing at the moment to
Yes.
see whether different etiologies are differently impacted by things like sleep, because it's going to help the clinician tailor those treatments. In fact, we have preliminary evidence to suggest that neuropathic injury, so nerve injury, is less likely to be impacted by sleep, whereas non-nerve injury is more likely to be influenced by sleep. So
Mm.
if your systemic inflammation, changes in systemic inflammation from changes in sleep are more likely to influence sensitivity and pain from damage that doesn't involve the nerve than if it involves the nerve.
That's actually okay. That's very interesting, because when I think of, say, nerve root compressions, I know some of the stuff that Nikolai Bogduk has done, talked about how it's not just about the compression of the nerve, but often the inflammatory response to it. But perhaps the exact inflammatory mechanism is slightly different. But it's also something I don't know much about.
So with nerve damage,
Mm.
so neuroinflammation, so the inflammation often is you have a world. The nerve is a world of its own, and you can have its own inflammatory environment within the nerve. In a lot of cases, it can be very confined to the nerve. Whereas if you damage a muscle, you tear a muscle or something like that,
Yes.
um, you can have it. It's almost a spillover, and it can be quite what's the right word? It can spread. It can be diffuse,
Diffuse, yes. Yeah.
and so systemic inflammation in a way can have a greater impact on that diffuse rather than that local confined. It might be very severe, but confined inflammation to the nerve.
David, to finish off, it's always interesting to ask our guests about anything that they're learning outside of their professional work. I mean, I know you've got a young family yourself and you're obviously doing a lot of research, but is there anything else that you're studying, exploring, or doing outside of your professional work at the moment?
Um, is the response meant to be academic?
To be honest, more often than not, it is.
Um, I consider myself a non-traditional academic. So I'm interested in things and I ask questions about things.
Mm.
But I don't stay up reading books to advance my brain every night. Look, I do have a young family and I have a strong passion for the sports. So that's where a lot of my interest comes from. I've been referred to as King Richard, the dad with their kids with sport. Um, so
Any particular
that
sport you're interested in?
look, I have my three kids are all Queensland champions in
All
their
right.
different sports.
Okay.
One of them
Great.
is a national champion, and another one has a chance to be national champion this weekend coming up. So
Yeah. Great.
diving, gymnastics, and martial arts.
Oh yeah. Great.
Mm. So that's where all my interest that I have time for outside of my work is probably in their sports.
Well, that keeps you busy, I'm sure.
It does.
David, thank you very much for coming on. It's been an excellent conversation. I think conversations like this are very important because I think a lot of the time we talk a lot about the biomechanics and the tissue capacity and things like that related to musculoskeletal injuries and pain, but it's really important to talk about these non-physical factors because they actually influence any type of injury, let alone just chronic pain. So thank you very much for being on today.
Thank you. And look, before I go, can I spruik a study that we're having, which is looking at exactly those things?
Mm,
We're looking at how everyday factors such as how you eat, move, and sleep influences day-to-day pain with people with back pain.
yes.
Um, and so we have a study ongoing at the moment. It's a huge US funded study,
Hmm.
and we're wanting people who have current back pain. And if you're interested in being involved, you'll get rewarded for being part of the study. It's
Mm.
also extremely interesting, and you'll get feedback on your own symptoms and things that you might not have been aware of um, that you'll get out of it. So if you're interested, look for back pain study under my name, David Klyne at the University of Queensland, and
Yeah.
you'll find the link page to get on and get involved.
Okay, yeah, great. And I'm assuming if people want to find out more about you or your research, they'll be able to find your publications on there as well, correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Most of my publications are listed in my UQ profile.
Yeah, great. Well, David, thank you very much again. And to all of our listeners who do listen in, please do like, subscribe, leave comments. It does really help us to share this information to our bigger audience. Thank you again, David.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate it.